I first met Jack in 1982, and we started working together in August 1983. I saw him almost every workday for the next 25 years. He was a colleague, friend, member of the family, and a loved one. We enjoyed many things together: food, ballet, theater, politics, and students. He did not share my love of Cornell, and I had no interest in sports. We both loved to travel, but never traveled together. But the tie that bound us together, most of all, was stories. Our lives were stories, and stories were our lives. For each of our commonality, there's a defining tale. During a dinner party for CIW tutors at my apartment, I was engrossed in a conversation on one side of the table, and Jack was on the other side. I must have been sniffling, because Jack got up, went into the kitchen, came back with a box of tissues, and handed it to me. I took them and said, "I remind him of his mother, and he reminds me of mine." Our immediate family has actually adopted a quote and a recipe from Jack's mother. She served meals to her husband and 4 children before sitting down to eat herself. After her first bite of food, she might say, because no one else had, "Delicious dinner, Marilyn." From time to time, we now use the same phrase with no name changed. My daughter's husband and children only recently discovered that Marilyn was Jack's mother. And sometimes, in Jack's absence from our Thanksgiving dinner, my son makes the famous turkey potatoes. Whenever Jack and I ate at a restaurant, I always knew what he was going to order before I knew what I was going to have. He loved Italian food and mourned the closing of Fusio on Connecticut Avenue, which had the best spaghetti and meatballs. But foodie that he was, Jack declared that Rosica was his favorite restaurant years ago. Washington Post food critic Tom Sesma only did so today. Jack had never been to the ballet before he came to Washington, and I enjoyed sharing the experience with him. He was more interested in seeing different ballets than repeating, but we both preferred programs with several shorter ballets rather than one long story ballet. After several years, using information in saved programs and yearly pocket calendars, I compiled an Excel spreadsheet with all the ballets we'd seen together. Jack kept it up to date and ranked the performances. We had tickets to see the New York City Ballet the day he died. Jack loved traveling. On his grand tour of Europe, he visited countries where friends were living. He traveled to Spain with his former student, Andrew Foote, who spoke Spanish. He visited Ginny Halfler in Geneva and traveled with her to Lyon, where they had an extraordinary 4-hour dinner at Paul Bocuse's famous 3-star restaurant. He traveled extensively with his family, and his brother Jimmy has shared their itinerary for Portugal with activities planned every 15 minutes. But when I expressed an interest in going to Greece with Jack, he told me that I was too old to travel with. Jack was the best kind of friend. He never kept score, and he always kept in touch. It didn't matter if others kept in touch or not. And he shared information he gathered with mutual friends. Long before the advent of electric social media, Jack was our own personal Facebook. Actually, I know a lot about his friends I've never met because he loves stories. For my 60th birthday, a friend hosted a party and asked everyone to write a story about me. Jack, explaining that I preferred to tell stories, proceeded to make a list of topics and punchlines for his 25 favorite stories of mine. He thought 60 would be too many. When my daughter Susanna was visiting the office one day, I told a story about something. Unfortunately, I have a tendency to repeat stories and never remember who I've told what. Susanna laughed when I was through, and Jack expressed amazement that she hadn't heard the story before. "Oh, I've heard it," she said. "I was just being polite." Jack had an incredible and indelible influence on over 3,000 students during his tenure at Cornell and Washington program. Many have written comments about his influence on them, which you'll see collected in a notebook of remembrances downstairs. Jack was a wonderful writer and was planning to write down his stories about students one day. What a shame he hadn't gotten to it. I hope many of you will add to the collection. I can't believe Jack's gone, but in a way, he isn't. His memories and stories keep him with me and all of us forever. It was a privilege to know Jack and to love him. He was a unique soul who touched us all in so many ways.
Hi, I'm going to have a lot more trouble than Linda and Carol did. I'll do my best. I'm really honored to be here today to talk about Jack's professional life and his impact on students. Although I wasn't present at the creation, I understand that a little over 30 years ago, Jack, with Ginny Hoffler and Linda and some others, put the academic meat on the bones of an idea that would allow Cornell undergraduates to spend a semester in Washington doing an internship and giving them the opportunity to perform some serious public policy research. At least according to Jack, and we know how modest he was, the organizing principle of the course was his. Students would write a thesis in stages, and they would be taught about methodology and the research process as they learned about the parts of the paper. Jack put this program into place, and then in the late 1980s, working with Steve Jackson, the process was refined and became an amazing experience for students and graduate student tutors alike. Over the years, as departmental stewardship of the program and its student constituencies changed, Jack, with Steve Jackson, and now the new Associate Director, David Silby, adapted ideas about the research, experience, writing connection to meet student needs and continue to provide an intellectually exciting and challenging semester. While it didn't seem so at the time, I was part of the team in its earlier stages. My husband, Steve McGovern, and I came down to Cornell in Washington in August of 1990. Steve and I both have strong first memories of Jack. We actually met him slightly before our tenure at the center began, as we visited in July to see where we would be living and meet the staff. Jack was there in the lobby, reading the Washington Post and eating a bagel. That would be a scene that we would see over and over again. I can picture the white and black tiled floor and the stairway leading up to Carol's desk and Linda's office just beyond to the left, with Steve's off to the right, and Jack always sitting on the sofa welcoming us. When we were at the program, Steve Jackson's class and organizational scheme were designed to guide students throughout the semester. But frankly, for new tutors, the plans were all so intimidating. I mean, some of us, well, we were a bit stuck on our own dissertations. So who were we to be pushing undergraduates through a thesis in one semester? Some of us didn't feel that confident that we had been all that well trained. Sorry, Cornell faculty. And that's where Jack came in. When I first started in the program, I was one of those who lacked that confidence, and I was concerned that the fundamental idea, writing the thesis in one semester, was flawed. And as some might tell you, I was a bit of a pain that first semester, but I became a convert. And like many converts, I have perhaps turned into a zealot regarding the importance of undergraduates performing independent research and learning how to write a true research paper. Jack Moran was central to my conversion. As my Steve will tell you too, we might have had some of the leading lights in political science on our dissertation committees, but it was Jack Moran who spent the time with us as we puzzled over research strategies and how to carry them out. Jack's contributions were great because he worked with us on the nitty-gritty as well as the big ideas. And I know that Jack's impacts were not simply confined to the two of us. He played an integral role in mentoring graduate students and producing excellent scholars. I'm not sure whether anyone at Cornell ever understood Jack's fundamental contribution to graduate student training, which is yet another element of the tragedy of his too early demise. But I want to emphasize today, where you see highly successful former CIW tutors, you see his influence. Where they go, also goes Jack Moran. While he was so important to tutors, Jack was essential to the undergraduate's education. For them, he was the consummate teacher who expertly knew how to guide them through the research process. Weekly, he would meet individually with his students after having read their drafts, intellectually poking and prodding them to sharpen their ideas, encouraging, laughing, and challenging them to do their best. He shaped so many students and gave them an unbelievable experience that was more than an intellectual one. Again, his mentorship was especially important at a place like Cornell, where incentives don't reward student contact. Jack was a different kind of teacher, and he made a difference in students' lives. He lived in the CIW complex with these kids, and he gave them his all. He wasn't unidimensional. He would talk to students about sports, organize outings, sponsor cultural events, and just encourage kids to get out and see. Jack was fun, and Jack was real, even if he was older than the typical tutor. And students appreciated him for the complete figure that he was. Of course, I don't know everything that Jack was to Cornell in Washington. His other colleagues and the other many generations of tutors here could all tell you wonderful things that he did, of which I have no knowledge. Through all these stories, though, would be the themes of giving, caring, intellectual stimulation, and laughter. Because Jack took the grads under his wing, helped them master the art of being a CIW tutor, and also encouraged them through their own theses, often giving useful advice on how to overcome methodological challenges and writing blocks, and aiding countless tutors in finishing so that they could move on to their faculty appointments. Jack watched us all go with best wishes, and I hope some pride in what he helped produce. In closing, we all miss you, Jack. We can't believe you're gone. I can't imagine 2148 O Street without you. I can't imagine the CFW experience now. But I do know that you have created something wonderful. You were part of building an outstanding program which has transformed students' lives. You have also helped to produce impressive scholars, teachers, practitioners, and other professionals who are now all over the country. We all remember you, Jack, because you were such a great friend with an enormous heart, and you told the funniest stories ever. Future generations of Cornell undergraduate and graduate students are much deprived by your loss, and CIW will never be the same. Like the hundreds of us that you guided, I will miss your laugh and your friendship, as well as your willingness at any time to talk about research methods. Thank you for all you have given me, Steve, and everyone else you've touched. We will never be the same, and we will never forget you, Jack Moran. Goodbye, my dear friend.
I didn't know Jack as well as many of you did. I only got to know him when he when I became director of the Cornell and Washington program. So I'll focus in on Jack as a Cornell and Washington professional. That's not to say that Jack didn't touch me at a personal level. When my wife would come down to Washington from Ithaca on a getaway weekend, I'd go to Jack and ask for restaurant recommendations, and Jack would give superb recommendations. We had many, many delightful dinners and sent many thank you notes to Jack as a result of that. And there was also Jack's way with a story. I have a good friend who's both Irish and a poet, and Jack reminded me of him. The stories had a certain drama to them, and you could hear the voices of the characters, and there was a wit and sort of a wry smile that went with them. I'd say that Jack's way with a story was almost the equivalent of Linda's. And of course, having the two of them together in the same room was a special delight. So something special about it. Where I really know Jack is as the head tutor and as the head resident at Cornell in Washington. And of course, he was a superb tutor. He affected the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of students and fellow tutors. He shaped the way they thought, he shaped the way they wrote, and he shaped the way they lived their lives. And I know many have come back to Cornell and Washington and thanked him for the way he contributed to them. But to me, perhaps even more important than the academic side of Jack was what Jack did for making sure that Cornell and Washington was a safe place. It's fundamental in something like Cornell and Washington, though the academics are really important, it's simply fundamental that it be a safe place for students. If parents or if the university at some point starts to be concerned that students may not be safe, that can put the whole program at substantial risk. There's sort of two things you can do to deal with that. One is to build a community where the students know each other and where they watch out for each other, and the other is to have good people in the building. And of course, Jack was simply fundamental to both of those aspects of the activity. Jack was the guy who was there at night, and if things can really go wrong, it's going to happen at night. And Jack was the guy that was there in the hurricanes and in the snowstorms. When things did happen, and they're inevitably going to happen, and somebody needed some medical assistance, Jack was the guy on the spot. He was able to stay calm and help other people stay calm. He was able to make good decisions and be decisive. He was able to handle tricky situations with nuance. As director, I was, knowing Jack was in the building, I never had concerns about student safety. When I think of Jack, I think of smart, reliable, steadfast, sturdy. He was an invaluable part of the program.
My husband, Christoph, couldn't be here today. He's actually in Germany visiting his parents, but he wrote some remarks and asked me to share them with you. So I ask you to suspend your belief for a moment and pretend that I am a 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German man. And hear it in that voice. We weren't destined to become friends. I've always loved fast cars and appreciated stiff drinks. Jack was fine with water for dinner and the occasional zip car rental. He quickly grew tired of Aaron Sorkin's fast-paced and oh-so-clever West Wing chatter. I was totally with Linda Johnson and just loved it to the last episode. There's a side story. Once we were on a trolley tour of DC landmarks with the freshly arrived summer students. Linda spotted Martin Sheen walking up 22nd Street. Naturally, she flung herself halfway out the trolley window and shouted at the top of her lungs, "We love you, President Bartlett." Jack, he just rolled his eyes. Jack hated golf, one of my favorite religions for obvious lefty reasons. And also because as a youngster, he had once worked in the Spalding factory, inhaling solvents while putting grips on at a rapid speed, impressing the foreman. But he just scoffed at my repeated attempts to get him to join me on the walk down the fairways. Now, we did have something in common. Newspapers, we agreed, needed to be inhaled. We just despised politicians who catered to the lowest common denominator. We fully subscribed to the Julia Child dictum that any dish can be made noticeably better with a lot more butter. And there was opera. Those evenings were special. The bustle of the day was done, and we had time to catch up, and always did so as if we were still sharing daily lives at the Cornell Center. And when the curtain rose, we were together in a magical world. Whenever the libretto got just too absurd, we would turn to each other and shake our heads. And whenever a singer did something special with their voice, we were delighted. Of course, Jack was utterly wrong to prefer comedies over tragedies. The choruses, they did a number of both of us each time. Besides sharing an intense overload of the senses, those evenings also showed what Jack was essentially about. He was the guy one could rely on absolutely. Jack moaned about my lack of adequate preparedness, but he always brought a couple of dollar bills so I could tip the coach attendant appropriately. And without miss, he always had honey lemon cough drops in his pocket, which he shared generously, while suspecting every single time that my pipe smoking probably didn't help with the coughing. And he was the guy who would take care of you no matter what. One memorable night, I got seated next to an elderly patron of the arts, and she had doused herself in just an enormous amount of perfume that breathtakingly reminded me intensely of the green soap with which the floors of my high school were deep cleaned on Fridays. He didn't care what others thought. For the next 3 hours, he let me lean over and breathe through his tweed jacket sleeve as a respirator replacement when it became just too much. When I needed him, of course he was there for me. We weren't destined to become friends, but somehow it happened. I'm glad it did. I miss my friend.
I'm Ken Forsberg. I knew Jack as a tutor. I was one of many tutors here, I think, at Cornell in Washington. And I am an attender at this Quaker meeting here. And so I'm going to use that experience to try and help get some more stories out. I think everyone has probably many stories about Jack. And we want to try and get some of those out so we can share our joint experiences of Jack. So we're going to do this Quaker style. I'm not going to call on anybody, but we've got about 10 minutes. I'm just going to sit down here. Those of you who are not Quakers, which is probably all of you, are maybe not as comfortable sitting in silence as I am, and as Quakers are. But we're going to sit here for 10 minutes and use the time to kind of remember Jack and think about Jack. And if you feel led to stand up and share a story about Jack, or a story that Jack used to tell, or your favorite memory of Jack, or anything like that, just please stand up and share it with us. And if there's a little bit of time in between, that's great. It lets us kind of think about what we've heard. And it often takes a minute or two before the first person stands up to say something. So don't freak out if it takes a minute or two before somebody stands up.
So I was a student at Cornell in Washington in 2007, and fittingly enough, Jack was not even my tutor. So I hope that speaks to how much he just made a difference in everyone's life that was there. And for those of us who said we didn't love Cornell and thought of it as big red tape, Jack was the big scissors. And for a bunch of us who was our first time living in a real city, and to come to DC and have someone who cared so much and would spend his time whenever you wanted to talk about anything, whether it be your paper that was due the next day and you had just started, or if it was how to make it home in a snowstorm. And I was thinking about when we all got together to remember Linda for her anniversary, that it was Jack that tracked us all down, and immediately we all jumped at the chance to remember what a great time we had. And of course it's Linda, but it's also Jack that made it such a community. And when I look back on Cornell, I look back on that semester as the best one I ever had. And it's because of Jack, and it's because of the community that he brought with all of us. So thank you.
Can I just say,
By all means, please.
I think Jack and taught me to argue effectively, because when we were the first married couple at Cornell in Washington, he would come down and watch, 30-something? And we'd have popcorn, drink beer, and I would be infuriated by the end of the evenings, because all of my arguments, my Marxism, my neo-structuralism, whatever, would be just wiped out. And I'd be like, how could he get away with it? What does he do? He just could undermine. What does he say? How can he do that? And then Dave would go by and I was like, you're right. And I slowly learned. But he never put me down. It was just like, well, what about this? And what about that? And he just really helped me learn to be somewhat, believe it or not, I mean, don't go by this inarticulate babble, but I can actually sometimes argue better now.
When I think about Jack, he's wearing a red sweater, and he's laughing. And he's probably one of his own jokes, but it was worth it. He was one of my case of emergency people, because Cornell in Washington had given him so much practice. He was very good at it. As a lot of the comments I've heard today, he was solid. He was a good man. He had a lot of heart, and he had an impressive number of spleens. And thinking about him, I thought about Yeats. You that would judge me, do not judge this book or that. Come to this hallowed place, where my friends' portraits hang, and look thereon. Ireland's history in their lineaments trace. This, where man's glory most begins and ends. And say, my glory was, I had such friends. It seems really, really unfair that Notre Dame is 6-0 this year, and he's not there to see it. And now I'm compelled to root for them. So, go Irish. We miss you, Jack.
I'm John. Jack was my tutor in spring 1990. You've all hit on so many wonderful stories and attributes of his, and they're all so true. He indeed had a big influence, I think, about the subsequent steps in my life, and many of them I can probably make a link to lessons learned through our discussions. A few years after I was a student with Jack, I remember there was some sort of ice cream social at the Cornell Club and the Cornell Washington Center. And it was through that Jack introduced me to my friend John Kay, who's here with me today. And we had turned out to be a year apart, but we became friends for life largely through Jack. And I think he had that instinct for people who would hit it off. And it turns out subsequently we've helped each other get jobs, helped each other get into grad schools and such. And we're here today largely because of him. Jack and I, we played tennis together. We went on bike rides together. You talked a lot about Europe. I think I can take credit for exposing him to the Caribbean because in January 2006, he and I went to St. Lucia together before I was married, and it was a wonderful trip. And he would tease me because he liked to go out very far in the ocean. And I like to stay near the shore because I have a bit of a shark phobia. which he got quite a bit of amusement out of. So I'd have an inclination for the pool rather than the depths of the ocean, but he was indeed a brave one. One thing that I'll always remember is it's about 11 years ago I went through a very difficult episode of depression. And I remember it was actually, we were somewhere on Florida Avenue about to cross the street. We must have gone to dinner or something. And I was a bit of a mess. And he not only helped me hang in there, but I remember he gave me, you mentioned Notre Dame, he showed me an article from a Notre Dame alumni magazine. And it was this a young female alumnus who had written an article to the magazine about her experience with depression. And it was a good ending to the story, obviously, and she wrote about her experience and how things were grinding to a halt, but she did the hard work and slogged through it, and it was victorious. And just that little one-page piece meant so much. I remember I even wrote to her, and her email was listed, and she wrote back. And it's just one of my memories of Jack, because he did that for me. It was a few years later, we went to St. Lucia. It seemed like when there were big movies, it was always meaningful for me to see them with Jack, especially once I now have a 3-year-old son, so it's very rare that I get out to a movie, but if my wife was out of town or we had a babysitter, maybe once a year I'd go. I think we saw Lincoln and Argo, and the last one, and many before that, but the last one was American Hustle, where I think that's where I met this fellow tutor behind Linda. And I think that's the last time I saw him. It was earlier this year. We'd always, talk about the movie, and he'd have, memories of history to go with it. And it was probably, I don't know, it must have been a month or two after that he had emailed John and myself together about hey, let's get together. It's been a while, and it was a few days after that I got the call from Linda. So, but I remember him on that happy note of always trying to connect people together, which he did in his last moments. So, thank you.
My name is Tim. I was at Cornell in Washington with Jack from the fall of '86 to the spring of '88. Sitting with Bob McKinless, who never ever changes. It's hard to believe. It was 28 years ago. One of the things that everything Linda said was true, but for me the truest was that Jack was much, much better at staying in touch with people than people, at least I was, at staying in touch with him. I was terrible at it. And years would go by, and then I would call him. And he had, at least with me, and maybe other people had this experience, this constant sense of surprise. I went through my life realizing that I was somehow surprising him. I was a Catholic who hated Notre Dame. I ate the same thing for lunch every day. I hated musical comedy, and there were so many things that he loved that he assumed that I would share with him, and I didn't. And he would always say, I'm not going to imitate him, but he had this thing where he would scream like, Mr. Burns, like, what is wrong with you? And then many years later, just a few years ago, I teach at Colgate, and I led the Colgate in Washington group for 2 years, which was really, really great to see Linda and Carol and Jack again, and we went to see Ginny's winning Peep display at the museum. And the final surprise for Jack was, and when Linda said this as well, the big red tape. Jack and I many times planned activities for students from Cornell and Colgate to do together. And he would say, you want to do this? And I would say, sure. And he'd say, what do you mean, sure? I said, yeah, let's do that. He said, where are you going to get the money? I said, well, I have the money. Colgate gave me the money. You can just do it? Yes. Just do it, Jack. I am actually in charge of this. And he would then scream at me, oh my God, Mr. Burns. You can't imagine what Cornell is like. So it was, like I said, a friendship of now almost 30 years. where, and I say this with just great affection for him. He was just a better friend to me than I ever was to him. But he knew that I cared about him, and he was always surprised by me. And it was just a wonderful thing to have in my life.
Tim claims I never change, but I really do. And when people meet me and say, you haven't changed a bit, I tell them it's because I was old when you met me then. I had a different relationship with Jack. I was on the other side of the fence, sort of the face of the alumni group here in Washington. But we shared a goal of trying to enhance the experience of the students here while they were in the program. And so the Cornell Club would put on events. Jack would help me publicize them, get students to sign up for the hikes, the bike rides, the canoe trips, things like that, and often participated in them himself. One of the things I most remember about Jack, and will always be grateful, when he had some tickets left over that he had sold to groups of students, if he had one or two left over, he would sometimes invite me to use it. So I've been to the Kennedy Center concerts with a bunch of the students, but my biggest event for which I am most grateful, and Carol shared in it too, was going to the Baltimore Orioles game when Cal Ripken broke the record. I think it was 1991. And that was a fabulous game. But he wanted a prize. He wanted something in return. And one of the things he wanted to do that he'd never been able to do was to climb to the top of the Capitol Dome. And the Cornell Club had an event where that was possible. And that gets tricky because you have to get the endorsement of a congressman. Actually, he's supposed to go with you. You climb up the girders and the things inside under the dome and get up on top. And I was able to get Jack in on that trip, and that was in return for my seeing Cal Ripken.
I'm John Kay, and I was a student of Jack's, who's my thesis instructor, in 1991 in the spring, shortly after John, who he introduced me to. And I was thinking that I cannot remember many of his stories, but there are many things about Jack that I learned that I think I've perpetuated. And in that way, I think I'm able to help carry on some of the good things that he represented. One, which John mentioned earlier, is that he was always connecting people. And always, it seemed, with nothing in it for himself, just to make a connection that would lead to something that would better others or better the world. And I've tried to similarly make introductions, connections to resources, connections to people. Another thing is that he was quite accepting. I remember I had a semester of people who he said were I guess beyond anything he experienced in terms of complaining. and he kind of somehow managed to make light of it and accept, I was going to say them, but I should say us, and move on. And he even taught me to be more accepting of myself. I was always lamenting, I was writing, like a 100-page thesis, how slow a reader I am. He would say, John, you're not a slow reader, you're a careful reader. And it just, it was like all of a sudden it was okay to be a slow reader if I called it something else. And I think he was right. So I think I learned to be more accepting of others and more accepting of myself that way. And then a third thing really is teaching. So I didn't go into academics or teaching, but I do find myself often at work taking on staff and trying to mentor them or take on training assignments or even informally really teaching them. And the approach, having not been formally trained as a teacher, The approach really, I think, some of it is maybe innate, but a lot of it I think I learned by watching an expert at this, and I will miss him very much.
I'm Steve Jackson, for those who don't know. And like Linda, for not quite as long as Linda, but for more than 20 years, I saw Jack just about every work day. Often, many times a day. There are many things I could talk about, but many have already been touched on. I think there's one thing I could touch on. When I first arrived at Cornell, Washington to become associate director and to teach the core course, the course was already there and it was already functioning very well. And Jack had played a very large part in instruction in that. I had also been teaching something similar to that on campus and had my own pretty strong views about how that might work. First few times Jack and I met before the course started, I was, surprising to many people probably, mostly in listening mode, trying to listen to him about what was being done and what hadn't worked so well and what had worked well. And there were some features. And tried to work on that. Once the course started, so this is in the fall of 1989, I think. I would say Jack and I had a running, heated argument. Because one of the words that no one's used was passion. And I always found Jack passionate about all these things, food, travel. He was also passionate about what he thought the students needed. Okay? And as many of the tutors have talked about, as well as former students, I mean, Jack was the front line in translating the sort of abstract stuff I was trying to do in class so that it actually helped students directly. There was no question. He was passionate about that. He was also passionate, though, about the course as a whole. And our major argument was that Jack thought that the grades I wanted to give students were too high. And we had, I think one could call it passionate conversations for much of the first year over that. As someone back said, Jack was very good at arguing. As someone else said, though, even as arguments often got heated, at just the right moment, Jack always knew when to laugh. Okay? And it would just break the tension, and that allowed us to progress so that the course, not only the grading, but the sort of way we structured the course, which developed over that first year or two, really was the product of Jack's pushing me pushing back. And it was a joint product. I couldn't have done the job I did for 21 years without Jack, not only doing all the things you've already talked about, but really even structurally working with me on how the overall course would work as well. Jack also became a devoted friend. He's the first person from Cornell, Washington, who came over to my WashU offices, all of 4 blocks away when I moved, and continued to come in over for lunch regularly. And again, lost a friend too early.
Well, I've noticed all these younger students get up, so I figured I'd get up. 1982, fall, in the Dreyfus Building, when somebody mentioned the safety of Cornellians, that was the issue there. At the time, it was effectively 16th or 17th in U, and there was drugs and prostitution and crime rampant, and the security was an issue, and I think they had a challenging time, Cornell did, recruiting students to come down here. And I reflect on Mr. Jackson's comments about tough grading, and that certainly wasn't my situation. I think he gave me a gift of a B+. I can remember distinctly writing a paper, I didn't know Washington as well then, on something that Congress was doing. And I was deep in research and following it up that had to do with changing the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act of 1972 or something, PL 91-142, I don't remember. And I was writing and outlining and writing, and he was pushing me, and sure enough, I attend this sort of major hearing on the bill. And this was 80% of the way through the semester. And at that hearing, they announced they're withdrawing the legislation. So I had to dramatically change my my paper, where we were going with it, where he was pushing me, which was making me think, and to why it was withdrawn. Much more of a political paper, which I relished. And in the end, I think I did a largely mediocre paper where he gave me a gift. So in his storytelling and humor, he may someday have told that story of the paper that imploded. If so, that was mine. And I'm grateful for Jack.
Hi, I'm Virginia Hoffler. I started at Cornell in Washington when the building was new, before it was finished. And I remember Linda had just been hired, and we were running around trying to make sure that all the little kitchen carts were in all the kitchens and all the lamps were in the rooms. And that's when I met Jack, right at the very beginning of this new building. My memories of Jack, like everyone else has said, they're memories of Jack telling stories. I'm not a storyteller. My memories of Jack are of him telling stories, and I know there are stories we share, but he could tell those stories so much better than I. I'm not going to try. But last night I was going through all these boxes of memories and photos, thinking I'm going to find those photos of Jack I know must be here. Apparently I also don't take photos. But the few that I found from Cornell and Washington, I would look at them and I would think to myself, who is that? I have to ask Jack, who is that? And I felt as if Jack was right there with me as I go through those memories. And I think, although in the last few years, I didn't see a lot of him, but he was still a part of my life, such a part because we've known each other for so long. We didn't have to see each other all the time. And we didn't. And I would save up my questions and comments for him. And I would think to myself, well, next time I see Jack, I'm going to have to ask him this or tell him that. And I still feel that way. And I know he's gone, and yet he's not really gone, because I think of him regularly, and I think of things that he would enjoy knowing about.
I'm Ben Ginsberg. I was director of the program in the late 1980s, I think.
Why vote?
That's right. And I actually have to take a lot of credit because I'm the one who sent Jack to Washington. When I was a government professor at Cornell, I told Jack that this would be a good thing for him to do for a year. So not only was I was right 30 times over. I think I sent Tim Burns to Washington. There are a lot of people here. Even Jackson. I think I sent you too. So I'm pleased to see so many people I haven't seen in a while. You all look older than you did then. I want to know what's happened. But as I sat here listening to what was said, I was thinking that I've actually over the years met a number of former CIW students, CIW alumni, and what I find interesting is that not a single one of them remembers the name of any professor from Ithaca who was the director of CIW. It's humbling. The name, they remember Linda, of course. They remember Carol, but what they talk about is Jack. Jack, who had no titles, had no endowed chair at Cornell, nevertheless had an enormous impact on the students. And every single CIW student to whom I've ever spoken, after a minute or two, will say Jack Moran. And it's obvious, and I see nodding around the room, it's obvious that Jack was the person who over the years really made CIW what it was. And I hope that CIW is able to survive Jack's passing, because he obviously had an enormous and wonderful influence on the program. So I did a good thing when I sent him to Washington.
Hi, I'm Melissa. It's hard for me to remember Jack without some dramatic exclamation coming to mind, like, Melissa, I am never coming to an election party at your house ever again. Or, we cannot go to Haleo together. Or, that was the worst Clay Buckholz outing ever. Or, what was Bill Belichick thinking? Or the periodic, you do not live in DuPont Circle, Melissa, you live in Georgetown. One memorable exclamation came when a group of us were comparing fortunes from fortune cookies at Miwa, a place that we regularly dined at. Beth and Tom's daughter Molly received a fortune that read, "You should always follow your dreams." Trying to be encouraging, I said, "That's a nice fortune and it's really good advice, Molly." Jack immediately exclaimed, "That is horrible advice." He then went on to name a prominent political figure who he was certain we all agreed should definitely not be following any dreams. Over my years of friendship with Jack, there were a lot of exclamations and vigorous, delighted laughs, like when he presented me with a sorry button about 3 minutes after I had said that my most gendered behavioral pattern was to apologize too much. And there were lots of stories on many topics, ranging from DC jury duty to student antics to his many traveling adventures, as many people have pointed out already. And there was a lot of mockery of my taste in movies and music and food. But at the same time, there were always many, many creative and delicious appetizers and meals. We just had a lot of fun and many adventures, and we marked many New Year's Eves together, and this New Year's Eve is going to be a difficult one, I think, for many of us. Perhaps the thing that I remember most about Jack, though, is how often he taught me to take the kind interpretation of things. Although, as has been said, Jack could certainly dish out snark, he did have a special way of gently suggesting that I take another person's perspective when I would get annoyed about something a coworker, a friend, or even a stranger had said or done. He was a good friend and a great person. I miss him every day as I walk by his house, and I try to remember one of the last things that he said to me. He said, "We just waste so much time." So here's to Jack, and to giving the benefit of the doubt to people around us, and to making the most of the time that we have, and to following our dreams, at least some of us, some of the time.
Hi, my name is Kevin Moose. It's an honor to be here today. I first met Jack back in 1975 when I went to Notre Dame. And he was my sophomore roommate from 76 to 77. When I was a sophomore, he was a junior, I guess. And then the next year, I promptly dropped out of Notre Dame, which Jack never stopped hassling me about. I got a lot depressed, whatever. And after 2.5 years there, I dropped out, came back, and finished up down here in D.C. And Jack and I, like all of us, I guess, every friendship's different, in its own way. And I came down to D.C. and because I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, I had to serve for 4 years. I was gone for 12 years in the military. But what a special friend Jack was, like, love, whatever word you use, I'm not sure. I guess love's the right word. We stayed in touch all those years, and I was gone for years at a time. I maybe saw Jack 4 or 5 times in those 12 years. I was very lucky. I remember now, I was in Italy from 1985 to 88, stationed at a small remote podunk site in the middle of nowhere. Jack came and visited me. We went to Florence together. He was on vacation. I took a couple of days off, and he came and stayed. And I lived in a small town of 500 people. I was the only American there, so I really was honored to show him part of my life when I was in the military. By that time, he was at Cornell. And after 10 years in the Army, I was doing this job I hated tremendously, and I got this phone call from the military saying, "Would you like to go to graduate school?" And I said, "Sure, can I go tomorrow?" And it was in the middle of the year, though, and a lot of schools wouldn't take grad students with January admission. So where's Professor Ginsburg? He just spoke. You probably don't remember any of this, but I called Jack up down here at Cornell. I said, "Jack, I have the chance I got to decide like in 2 weeks, like where can I go to school?" And he said, "Well, call Ginsburg's up at Cornell." And I gave you a phone call, you asked me my 10-year-old undergraduate grades, and they were okay, and I told you what my GRE score was. Okay, you're in, come on down. So I went down to Cornell. And had a class. Professor Jackson was one of my teachers there. It was great. And, for 18 months, I got to wear civilian clothes and grow my hair long. And I was still in the military. And then I got out of the Army in 1992 when the Soviets collapsed and the big drawdown hit. But through all those years, Jack and I stayed in touch. And then when I got home, we fell in this really nice pattern. I didn't see him often, but every 3, 4, 5 months we'd get the itch. And one of us would call the other one up to go out, have a couple drinks, have dinner, and of course talk 2, 3, 4 hours about politics. Always came back to that. And I'd call Jack the smartest guy I ever knew, and he'd say, "Shut up, don't tell anybody that." And I became a high school teacher in the mid-'90s, and I've told hundreds of kids about this guy, Jack Moran, who, was he the smartest guy in the world? I don't know, but he's the kind of guy who knew a lot about everything. And I talked about his job, and I know a lot of the students have spoken. What a great job. You work with kids, small groups every semester. And I said, here's a guy who, counsels kids and gives directions, whether it's writing about economic policy, health. At one time, he invited me to have dinner in his apartment with 3 young students who were writing about women in the military. And the thesis was something about, women's mobility, why are there so few female colonels and generals, and I talked about why I thought that was. So he made me part of his life, and I enjoyed making him part of my life. And so for all these years, again, even when I came back home to Silver Spring, and Jack was only 6 miles away, we weren't constant friends, constant in contact. We were constant friends. We weren't constantly in contact. But we had this routine going for years and years. For every couple months, one of us would call the other, normally within a day or two, that the other one would have the same thought. And we get together someplace, normally down here, DuPont Circle, a local restaurant, and I just really valued his friendship, his wisdom. I bitched at him a lot when we were in Notre Dame together. He was the kind of guy who could sit, read a 500-page book, put it down, and get it. I was the kind of kid that had to read it twice, take notes on every page, and I might get to say so I tell my high school kid, there was this guy doing college who could read any book, put it down, and he had it. This lock trap mind, and I had to do it 2 or 3 times and take notes. And I guess ever since the news of Jack's passing, which caught me by surprise and shocked everyone, I guess a great testament to his life is we're still. Every couple weeks I wake up thinking I got to give Jack a call. It's time to get together, go out for that dinner again. And it won't happen again, but it will in a way. Jack lives on, in my memory, in a very unique way, going all the way back to the mid-1970s at Notre Dame, and then all those years being away and then being together every couple of months. But I really valued him as a great friend. My parents knew him and loved Jack tremendously. Most of my siblings knew Jack. He would come to my house occasionally for dinner and to hang out. So it was just a pleasure and honor knowing him and being part of his life. And I'd always joke about every dinner that when we had to have a form or something, that I could get 6 graduate credits for having dinner with him for a couple of hours. And, all the stuff he talked about, all the stuff that I learned about politics and the stuff that he was working on. So I'm just very sorry to the family for Jack's passing. He was a great friend, 30 plus years. And I guess the real testament is he'll never really be gone. I know the rest of my life I'll get this itch every couple of months to call Jack up, get together for a beer and for dinner and talk about politics. And we'll have this conversation long distance now, I guess, or however that works. But he'll always be in my mind, and he was just a great friend of mine and my family's, and just a treasured friend. So thank you for saying.
My name is Beth Weichman, and I met Jack in 1997, and when I came to work at Cornell in Washington. And I stayed in Washington because I loved it so much and never left. And so he has been part of my circle of wonderful friends for all those years. And I've been thinking about Jack a lot the last few weeks and listening to everyone today express how they feel about Jack. What strikes me about Jack is that anything Jack did, he put his whole heart and soul into. Whether it was following Julia Roberts' career, whether it was rooting for Notre Dame football, and I'll tell you, if anyone's had the experience of living downstairs from Jack during a Notre Dame football game, you'd think the whole building was about to collapse. Whether it's bringing appetizers to dinner, which turn into dinner because it's all the food any 7 people could ever eat. Anything, whether it's working with a student, whether it's directing a course, whether it's just being a great friend and keeping in touch and loving the people that you love. Jack put his whole heart and soul into it. And I was thinking when Ken said 10 minutes, I thought, if Jack had been here, he never would have been able to only speak for 10 minutes because every story Jack told, he told with such heart and such feeling. And I'll tell you, I always think, when I think of Jack, I always think about the disasters we had at Cornell and Washington. And I was thinking, there is no person, probably besides my lovely husband, no person I'd rather have with me at 2 o'clock in the morning when the pouring rain, when I'm trying to convince the District of Columbia Police Department that they really don't need to come into Cornell and Washington tonight. And when there's water pouring out of the computer room on the first floor at 3 a.m., I'm going to call Jack, and he's going to be there, and he's going to tell the funniest story about it the next day. So I just couldn't let the opportunity to say how much Jack's friendship and collegiality meant to me. I taught at Cornell in Washington this summer, and I'll tell you, I had that same feeling. I walked in the door, and I expected Jack to be sitting there on that red couch reading the Washington Post. And I always, every time I was teaching and I heard someone get on the elevator and somebody opened that door, I thought, it's Jack. And there really is a place in my heart that Jack will always be in. And it was what a wonderful person to have known.
We can continue this downstairs, but before we break up, does anyone have any last quick remembrances they wanted to stand up and share before we break up into smaller groups?
joined the Cornell family in 2008. And I gained a true family. It's been the place where it was a job, but we were all family. And Jack, he was like an uncle. Thank you. I left DC about a year and a half ago, and actually Jack was a major part of that, because I loved Cornell and Washington so much, I really didn't want to leave to take on another job. But I talked to Jack about that, and he encouraged me to go on. We're all gonna miss Jack, and this is supposed to be the farewell, but it's not farewell. And his stories, the passion that he had, Jack will always be here. So, with that, I say thank you for coming. There's a book over there to sign or leave your comments to share with Jack's family. And then please join us downstairs.